really wanted this girl to take care of my son." "Oh, Sarah, you shouldn't say that. It's bad for the daughter-in-law." She glanced at me and smirked. The day of my husband's funeral, my in-laws suddenly decided that they wanted his ex-wife to preside over the ceremony instead of me. His ex-wife Mina was dressed appropriately, but her heavy makeup and smile didn't belong at a funeral. I couldn't believe they would stoop so low. How could they not understand how Frank must have felt dealing with such unsupportive parents? I could feel the anger rising in my chest. "I'm leaving." I had wanted to quietly say goodbye to Frank, but with his parents and Mina there, it was impossible. Tears streamed down my face, but I left the funeral without looking back. A few days later, Frank's lawyer came to see me and showed me Frank's will. After I confirmed the contents, I called for Frank's parents and Mina. When they saw the will, they went into a complete panic. My name is Emma. I'm 34, and I work at a company. My husband Frank was the same age and worked at the same company. We met through a company project where we were assigned to the same team. I had never spoken to him before, but he had a bold way of expressing his opinions to even senior employees, and I was drawn to that. As we worked together, we gradually became friends. "If you're okay with it, will you date me with marriage in mind?" "Of course." We laughed together. 6 months later, we got married. We didn't have a ceremony, just submitted our marriage certificate, but we were happy. "No matter what challenges come our way, I'll protect you." I still remember Frank's proposal clearly. But 5 years after our marriage, Frank passed away. From the moment his illness was diagnosed to his death, it all happened so quickly. I couldn't accept the reality standing there in shock. But time is relentless, and I had to face the reality of arranging the funeral. I picked the venue, contacted Frank's parents and friends, and tried to move forward. Frank's parents had no intention of helping with the arrangements. "Let us know when the date is set." That's all his mother said before hanging up. I had foolishly hoped they might help. I found myself moving forward, detached from my deep sadness, focusing on the tasks at hand. On the day of Frank's funeral, I was in charge of the ceremony, standing as the representative of the family. There were no relatives helping with preparations, so I had to greet all the attendees alone. "Are you Emma?" "Yes, that's me." I responded reflexively, and the woman who called out to me chuckled softly. Her gaze was intense, and I felt uncomfortable under her scrutiny. She was dressed properly, but wore heavy makeup, smiling despite the occasion. She looked like she was around my age, but I didn't recognize her. "What a dull venue, right?" My mother-in-law entered the venue with Frank's father, complaining about everything. "Oh, Emma, I didn't see you there. So plain I almost missed you." She smirked cruelly as she looked at me. "Thank you for coming during such a busy time." "A funeral at such an inconvenient time. What an ungrateful son." Sarah giggled while my father-in-law Brian nodded in agreement. I felt anger bubbling inside me. I wanted to say something, but a woman interrupted. "So what should I do?" "Who are you?" The woman laughed and looked at my in-laws. "This is Mina, Frank's ex-wife." "Ex-wife?" I could feel my skin crawl. I knew Frank had been married before, but I never thought his ex would attend his funeral. Mina seemed completely unconcerned with my feelings. "Nice to meet you." She smiled as if it were a normal introduction, not a funeral. I was taken aback. What was she doing here? "We asked Mina to preside over the ceremony." I couldn't believe my ears. Frank's parents wanted his ex-wife, not me, to be the one presiding over his funeral? "I'm the current wife, and I'll be presiding over the funeral." I stood firm, but my in-laws laughed at me. "Sorry, but we think Mina is more suitable to be Frank's wife." "We never accepted you as part of the family. You should just sit quietly." They had never intended to acknowledge me. It was clear they wanted me to handle the dirty work while they took the credit. Then Sarah approached Frank's coffin with Mina and said something unforgivable. "I always wanted this girl to be the one to take care of my son." "Oh, Sarah, that's not fair to Emma." Though she said it with concern, Her face was smiling when she turned back to look at me. In that moment, my anger exploded. I'm leaving. I had wanted to quietly say goodbye to Frank, but with his parents and Mina there, it was impossible. Tears streamed down my face, but I left the funeral without looking back. Back home, I collapsed onto the couch. I couldn't even bring myself to change out of my clothes. The frustration, sadness, and helplessness swirled together, making it impossible to move. The funeral must be over by now. Did Mina really take over my role, giving a speech about her memories with Frank? The only thing left is the burial, but what if they take Frank's ashes? The thought alone was unbearable, but I didn't have the energy to go back and fight them. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally, after losing Frank. I lay on the couch, consumed by regret, wondering how things had come to this. How had I lost my place to his ex-wife? I couldn't help but think that maybe I was to blame for not being able to protect my place. Frank and I had made a promise before we got married, and now I had failed him. That promise was something no one else knew about, a secret between just the two of us. When Frank proposed, I had to tell him the truth. I told him that if we were going to get married, he needed to know something about my past. Frank, I don't have parents. He looked at me seriously and said, "Only, I see." I had hidden this fact from everyone up until then. My parents had both passed away when I was young, and my grandparents raised me. Growing up without parents had subjected me to all kinds of unkindness. Teachers made cruel comments, and my classmates would tease and bully me in elementary school. That experience left a scar, and I stopped telling anyone about my parents. "Thank you for telling me." Frank's response was so different from what I had expected. He smiled warmly, gently patting my head, and my eyes welled up with tears. "I've been hiding something too. I'm bisexual. I got married in my 20s, but I divorced after 2 years." His confession surprised me. There had been no hint of this in his demeanor or behavior. "When I got divorced, things got messy with my parents. I ended up cutting ties with them." I didn't know the details, but Frank had become estranged from his parents after his divorce. His face looked tense as he told me, and I realized it must have taken a lot of courage for him to share this with me. I felt grateful that he trusted me enough to open up, and that he shared vulnerability just as I had. We began our relationship with that mutual trust, eventually leading to our marriage. To respect Frank's wish to keep his second marriage a secret from his parents, we didn't have a wedding ceremony. We didn't need a big celebration, just being together was enough. But our happiness didn't last long. A year after we got married, Frank started receiving calls from an unknown number. He ignored them at first, but when the calls kept coming, he finally answered. To our shock, it was his estranged parents. "How did you get my number? What do you want?" Frank's voice was angry, and I could hear the frustration in his tone. "Don't ever call me again." He hung up with a sigh. "Is everything okay?" "They're having money troubles. Apparently, they asked around to get my number and found out I got remarried." He tossed his phone onto the couch with a sigh. Frank's parents, who I had never met, had started snooping around, trying to insert themselves into our lives. It made me uneasy. Frank noticed the worry on my face and gently wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Don't worry. They don't know where we live, and I'm not going to get involved." "I know." Frank smiled reassuringly, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That feeling turned out to be right. One day, while I was doing housework, the intercom rang. I looked at the monitor and saw an unfamiliar elderly couple. "Yes, who is it?" "It's Frank's mother." Her voice was bright and cheery, but I froze in place. If she was Frank's mother, the man next to her must be his father. How did they find us? We never told them our address. "Hurry up and let us in." I could hear the sound of them trying the door, even though it was locked. My body began to tremble with fear. Our building had an automatic lock at the entrance, so they shouldn't have been able to get to our front door without being buzzed in. "How did you get in?" "That's not important. Open the door." My father-in-law's voice was angry as he pounded on the door. Scared, I unlocked and opened the door.
Finally, you must be Emma, right? We didn't expect much from a woman who didn't even come introduce herself after getting married.
Frank's parents stepped into our home, sighing with disappointment. Even though it was my first time meeting them, they immediately looked down on me. Frank must be out of his mind to leave a wonderful woman like Mina and marry someone like you. Leave her? What do you mean? What do I mean? Frank and Mina had a perfect life together until he walked out on her.
And then, out of nowhere, he cut ties with us. He forbade any contact, so we couldn't even ask him why.
Brian's words, forbade contact, struck me as odd. I remembered that Frank had mentioned cutting ties with his parents, but this sounded much more formal, like a legal document. It made me realize just how bad things must have been between Frank and his parents for him to take such drastic action. How did you find out where we live? I asked without thinking, but they looked at each other and then replied nonchalantly. We hired a private investigator to track you down. Imagine our surprise when we found out Frank had remarried. I was shocked and horrified. They had gone so far as to hire someone to follow their own son? Why are you here? My voice trembled as I asked the question. We came to see if you're truly fit to be Frank's wife. Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. They were here to judge me, as if I needed to prove my worth to them. Wait, you can't just... I tried to protest, but they cut me off.
We'll be back next week. Make sure the place is cleaned up by then. Don't bother trying to avoid us.
With those parting words, they left as suddenly as they had arrived. I stood there, stunned by their storm-like visit. I didn't tell Frank about their visit right away. I thought it might be too painful for him, given that he had cut ties with them. I decided I would confront his parents next time and ask them not to come back. After all, I believed they would understand if I just explained. Looking back, that moment marked the beginning of the end for our marriage. Frank's parents started showing up more frequently. They never called in advance, and their visits always caught me off guard. As I had planned, I tried to reason with them. I have my own schedule, so it's difficult when you show up unannounced. Could you please call beforehand next time? They ignored my request, exchanging a knowing smirk between them. Emma, are you under the impression that you can just do whatever you want?
You married Frank, which means you'll be under our watch for the rest of your life.
Their words chilled me to the bone. I stood there, speechless, as they continued to speak. If you back down and accept your place, we might let it slide.
You don't deserve to be with our son.
Their cold, disdainful stares made my stomach churn.
Compared to Mina, you're just useless. She was an amazing woman. No matter how hard you try, you'll never even come close.
His words were like a blade cutting deep into my heart. Was I really such a terrible person? Stop standing there and get lunch ready. We haven't eaten yet. Without giving me a chance to respond, they demanded I prepare a meal. I made lunch, putting all my effort into it, but their reactions were as cold as ever. You're really bad at cooking, aren't you? This is what happens when someone grows up without parents. Mina, on the other hand, was such a great cook. If we lived with you, we'd have to eat terrible food every day. They looked at each other and laughed as they insulted me. They had clearly done their research and knew I had lost my parents. Their cruel remarks stung more because they felt so intentional. I bet you don't even clean properly. She pointed to the corner of the room, letting out a theatrical sigh.
And the way you fold laundry is awful. Mina always did it perfectly.
Every time I did something around the house, they criticized me and compared me to Mina. It made me feel like I was being erased, like I had no value.
Do you ever think about how much Frank must be putting up with to live with you? No matter how hard you try, you'll never be enough for him.
Their one-sided torment continued until they left, leaving me crumpled on the floor crying. Even after all this, I still couldn't bring myself to tell Frank. I didn't want him to feel sad, knowing what his parents were doing. But as time went on, the stress started to take its toll on me. I couldn't sleep, worrying that they might show up unannounced again. I realized I couldn't live like this anymore.
You haven't been yourself lately. Did something happen?
His question was the tipping point. Tears poured out of my face, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. I told him everything. How his parents had hired a private investigator to find us, how they constantly belittled me and compared me to Mina, and how their unexpected visits made me anxious all the time. Frank listened quietly as I cried. Finally, I began to calm down, and my tears stopped.
So they've been coming to the house.
His voice was filled with guilt, but none of this was his fault. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry. Frank sighed and pulled me into a hug. The anger he felt wasn't directed at me. It was for his parents and what they had done to me.
I'm so sorry they've put you through this. You've been dealing with it all on your own, and it's not fair. My family, the only family I have, is you, Emma.
His words brought me comfort.
I should have known sooner. I had no idea how awful it was. I'm really sorry, Emma.
I wanted to tell you, but I didn't want to burden you. I apologized sincerely, and Frank sighed, pulling me close.
It's not your fault. They shouldn't be treating you like this. You're my family now, not them.
Frank's voice wavered as he spoke, but I could feel his anger and sadness. He was angry at his parents for putting me through so much.
From now on, I'll handle it. You won't have to face them alone ever again.
His words filled me with relief. I hugged him tightly, grateful for his support. After we talked, Frank became determined to deal with his parents directly. He knew they wouldn't stop unless he confronted them himself.
I'll make sure they never bother you again.
His resolve was strong, and I trusted him completely. Frank and I discussed how to handle the situation, and we decided he would talk to them the next time they showed up. The day came sooner than expected. As usual, Frank's parents showed up at our door unannounced, ready to cause more trouble. But this time, Frank was ready for them. He had taken the day off work and parked his car around the corner so they wouldn't suspect he was home. When I opened the door, they were shocked to see Frank standing behind me. "Frank, what are you doing here?"
"I've been waiting for you."
Frank's voice was firm as he stepped forward to face them.
"You two need to leave now."
His words hung in the air, and I could see the surprise on their faces.
"What's gotten into you? Is this how you talk to your parents? I've had enough of your behavior. You've treated Emma terribly, and I won't stand for it anymore."
"You've changed, Frank. It's all because of her, isn't it?"
If by her you mean Emma, the woman I love, then yes. But it's you who made me cut ties with you in the first place.
Frank's voice shook with anger. His parents didn't still seem to grasp the severity of the situation.
We did what we had to do. Mina was a much better match for you. Stop bringing up Mina. She left me. It was her choice, not mine.
That's not what she told us. She said you abandoned her. Frank let out a frustrated sigh, realizing they were still clinging to Mina's lies.
Mina lied to you. She's the one who wanted the divorce. You never listened to my side of the story. Mina would never do something like that. It's all this woman's fault."
His father pointed at me, his face red with anger.
"Don't you dare blame Emma for anything. The only ones responsible for this mess are you two."
Frank stepped in front of me, shielding me from their glares.
"We're done here. Go home and don't come back."
His parents were stunned into silence. They hadn't expected Frank to stand up to them like this.
"You're not welcome in our lives anymore. If you try to come here again, I'll make sure we cut ties permanently."
His voice was calm, but filled with finality.
"You can't be serious, Frank." "I am. This is goodbye."
With that, Frank closed the door on his parents. I watched as he let out a deep breath and sat down exhausted.
"I'm sorry you had to go through that."
I knelt beside him and wrapped my arms around him. "You don't have to apologize. You did what you had to do." Frank's eyes filled with tears as he hugged me back. It must have taken so much strength for him to face his parents like that, all to protect me. I promised myself that I would always be there to support him, just as he had done for me. A few moments later, we received devastating news. Frank was diagnosed with a terminal illness. By the time we found out, It was already too late to do much. Frank's condition worsened quickly, and soon he was confined to a hospital bed. I visited him every day, trying to stay strong for him, but inside, I was crumbling. I wished I had noticed the signs earlier. Wished I could have done something. But Frank always met me with a smile.
It's not your fault, Emma. Even I didn't notice until it was too late.
He would hold my hand and reassure me, even as his body grew weaker. His smile, though, never faded. But seeing his smile only made it harder for me. One day, as I sat by his bedside, unable to hold back my tears, Frank gently touched my face.
Emma, smile for me. When you smile, it makes everything better.
His request was so heartbreaking, yet I knew I had to fulfill it. So I smiled, even though it hurt. Frank smiled back, his eyes soft and full of love. A month later, Frank passed away. His funeral was a nightmare. Instead of being allowed to mourn in peace, I had to deal with his parents and Mina. They tried to take over, disrespecting Frank's wishes and undermining my role as his wife. I had to leave the funeral early, heartbroken and defeated. When I returned home, I collapsed on the couch, too drained to even change out of my funeral clothes. The sadness and frustration consumed me, and all I could do was cry. I hated that Mina and his parents had hijacked what should have been Frank's peaceful farewell. Worse yet, I feared they might take his belongings too, but I was too exhausted to go back and fight them for it. I just lay there, grieving the loss of my husband and feeling utterly powerless. How could they take so much from me, even now? I remembered a promise Frank and I had made before we got married. It was something deeply personal, something that made us feel even closer. Frank, I never told anyone, but my parents passed away when I was very young. I had confided in Frank about losing my parents, a secret I had kept from everyone else. When I was growing up, I had been judged for it by classmates and even teachers. It was a source of deep pain for me, and I hadn't shared it with anyone until Frank.
Thank you for telling me.
Frank's reaction was nothing like what I had feared. He simply smiled warmly and held my hand, making me feel safe. Then he shared his own secret with me.
I've been keeping something from you too. I'm bisexual. I got married in my 20s, but we divorced after 2 years.
I was shocked, but also moved by his openness. I could tell how difficult it had been for him to share this with me.
My parents didn't take it well. They blamed me for the divorce and cut ties with me.
That explained why Frank had been so distant from his family. They had sided with Mina, believing her lies and treating Frank like the villain. Frank had walked away from his family, choosing to build a life with me instead. He had been through so much, yet he had always put me first. That's why I had to be there for him when he was at his weakest. That's why I needed to protect his legacy. Days after the funeral, as I was going through Frank's belongings, I received a call. It was Frank's lawyer.
Mrs. Emma, I have something important for you. It's Frank's will.
My heart stopped. Frank had written a will. When? The lawyer asked me to come by his office, so I agreed. When I got there, he handed me the envelope, and my hand shook as I opened it. Frank's familiar handwriting filled the page, and as I began to read, tears welled up in my eyes.
Emma, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. But I want you to know being with you made me the happiest I've ever been. I promised you I would protect you, no matter what. Even now, I want to keep that promise. You're my only heir. I left everything to you. No one else. Not my parents, not Mina. Only you. I've made sure that the lawyer knows all my wishes, and they can't be challenged. Please, Emma, stay strong.
The more I read, the more I cried. Even in his final days, Frank had thought of me, making sure I would be protected. But there was more. As I continued reading, I realized that Frank had anticipated everything. He knew his parents and Mina would try to interfere, and he had planned for it.
If they try to take anything from you, show them this letter. This is my final word.
My tears flowed freely as I finished reading. Frank's love and care were woven into every word. I wiped my eyes, gathered my strength, and made a decision. I needed to confront his parents and Mina. It was time to put an end to their manipulation once and for all. I called Frank's parents and Mina, asking them to meet me. The moment I mentioned Frank's will, their attitude changed. They arrived at my house in no time, faces filled with expectation.
So, it's about the inheritance, right?
Of course, the inheritance belongs to us. We raised Frank.
Yes, we're the ones who deserve it. I assume that's why you called us here. They didn't even try to hide their excitement. Their true intentions were crystal clear.
I'll be receiving part of it too, as a family member.
Mina smiled sweetly, acting as if she had a right to everything. I could see in their eyes that they had already mentally spent the money. So, how much exactly is the inheritance? They were growing impatient. I glanced at the lawyer, who nodded, giving me the courage to start. First of all, Frank was my husband, and he loved me until the very end. He left his estate to me, and I'm here to honor his wishes. Their faces shifted, confused by my serious tone.
According to Frank's will, Emma is the sole heir. Frank made it clear that no one is entitled to his estate or any part of it.
The lawyer read Frank's words aloud, making it clear that I was the only person he trusted with his inheritance.
This is nonsense.
How can Frank choose her over his parents? This must be fake. They were furious, accusing me of forging the will. We can have a handwriting expert verify it. But if you can't recognize your own son's writing, that says a lot about how little you knew him. My words left them speechless.
Frank's will was given directly to me, signed by Frank himself and witnessed. There's no doubt about its authenticity.
The room fell silent as the truth sank in.
Frank also stated that his remains are to be handled by Emma. He specifically mentioned that his parents are not to take or interfere with his ashes.
His parents' faces drained of color. They had hoped to claim his remains, but Frank had foreseen their plans and made sure they had no right to them.
Furthermore, Frank addressed Mina in the will as well.
Mina's eyes widened with hope, but that hope was quickly shattered.
Frank stated that he wanted to make it clear that their divorce was initiated by Mina. She claimed she no longer loved him, and she manipulated his parents to turn against him.
That's not true. You can't prove it.
Mina panicked, trying to defend herself, but the lawyer continued.
Frank investigated after their divorce. He discovered evidence that Mina had been involved with several other men during their marriage. He has photos and testimonials from mutual friends to back up these claims.
The color drained from Mina's face as she realized she couldn't lie her way out.
Mina, is this true? We believed you. We trusted you.
I never meant for it to get this far.
For the first time, Mina's confident demeanor cracked, and she seemed genuinely afraid. How could you lie to us? We sided with you all these years. The room was filled with tension as Mina's deception was exposed. Frank also made it clear that if Mina were to harass me or interfere with his wishes, I would be entitled to sue her for damages. I already have a lawyer prepared to move forward with this claim if necessary. Mina was visibly shaken.
I can't pay that. How could you do this to me?
She began to panic, her voice rising.
Frank made arrangements to have the claim sent to your workplace and your family's home if necessary. You may want to check your phone. There should be messages from your parents by now.
Mina quickly grabbed her phone, her hands trembling.
No. That's why they've been calling me nonstop.
It was clear that Mina's family had already received the legal notice.
This is unfair. It's been 6 years since we divorced. The statute of limitations is 3 years. You can't do this.
Normally, yes, but there's something called a statute of repose. It allows claims to be made up to 20 years after the wrongful act if certain conditions are met. Frank was able to gather the necessary evidence after the divorce. That's why I can still pursue this claim. Mina's face went pale as she realized there was no escaping it. This is Frank's final wish. He made sure I would be protected just as he promised. So I will not back down. You will not win. With that, Mina fell silent, finally realizing she had lost. Frank's parents, who had once been so smug, were now too stunned to speak. After years of manipulation and deceit, I had finally won. Mina's family quickly paid the damages, knowing they had no choice. I received Frank's belongings and filed a legal document to sever ties with his parents forever. From that moment on, they were no longer a part of my life. I moved to a new apartment, far from the painful memories of the past. Though the grief of losing Frank remained, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in a long time. Frank had kept his promise. Even after his death, he protected me. And now, I had to honor him by living the life he wanted for me. I'll always remember your words, Frank. No matter what challenges come my way, I'll stay strong just like you told me to. I left my apartment that day, feeling Frank's presence with me. I'm off to work. As I closed the door behind me, I could almost hear his voice.
Take care.